I just want to first of all introduce our guest today. First guest, Eliana Martins, is a one Malama at the Osiri University. She's got a bachelor's in international relations from the University of Lisbon in Portugal. And she's also done European Masters in Human Rights and Democratization. So again, she's also the author of humanreflections.com. And in addition to that, she is a gender, business, and human rights expert. And she's a woman of many colors. She's a commissioned writer for the United Nations and NGOs through Content Engine, and also a consultant on gender equality and corporate social responsibility. So everyone join me, welcome Eliana Martins. And following up from that introduction, I also introduced Dr. Nneka Onuma. I came in when she was speaking really passionately. She's got a BSc in Family Social Science from the United States and an MSc in Human Services, also from the United States. And she's got a PhD in Multidisciplinary Human Services, also from the United States. She's developed partnership with various stakeholders for curriculum innovation and student enrollment. And she's got extensive experience working in the field as education coordinator and curriculum support coordinator. Again, she's also a woman of different shades. She's got a long history of coaching and supervising professionals for impact. So again, join me, welcome Dr. Nneka Onuma. And we've our very own Paul Easterling. So we all know him. He's not new to us today. So although Paul is co-hosting with me, I might be asking you some questions, Paul. So again, I'll be starting with you right now. So Dr. Paul Easterling, could you please, talk to us, since we are talking about advancing Africa? Let's, start off by having you shed more light on collective action course, which you have designed and you have developed. What's the title, and how can people sign up for this? What are your expectations in terms of if someone has enrolled on it, what would they be learning from the course?
Oh yes, the collective action course is a course I have been very interested in creating for a number of years. And when Dr. Kalu Osiri came to me and asked me to do it, I was excited to get started. And the basic focus is to understand the history of resistance for African people over the millennia. We start an ancient Kemet and discuss several times where Kemet had to defend itself, to collectively work together to defend itself against outside encroachment, the Romans, in particular, the Greeks. And I wanted to use this as a model to move forward in Pan-African thought and action, because Africa has always had things that the rest of the world has wanted, and because of that, it's had to defend itself. And another point is that Africans are often, it's funny because Africans are seen as hyper aggressive and violent, but we're also seen as passive and docile when we're pictured as slaves, and the imagery sometimes is not supportive of African people defending their own interests. So in looking through history, we can see that that is a clear ahistorical perspective, and that's not accurate. So I wanted this class to show that African people have always looked out for their interests and defended it quite well. So moving on from Kemet, we can see African people rising up all over the continent to develop their own interests, to work together collectively, not just during the Maafa, which is the Great Disaster, or the slave trade, but before that, with efforts of colonization, both European and Islamic or Arabic colonization. African people have always come together to defend themselves And we continue to do this, and this um, track that I'm going through in the class will ultimately end up with the BLM movement and the NSARS movement, and work on developing ideas for how do we continue to struggle, and how do we continue to um, look out for our own interests on this planet.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Easterlin. I would just want to focus more. Let me just move on to the ladies. So, Miss Martins, I'll come to you, and please, Dr. Onuma, please feel free to add your voice, lend your voice to all of this conversation. So, Miss Martins, I know you live in Switzerland, and you're a global human rights expert. So, here is a big and broad question: what's the status of human rights in Africa as a whole?
Well, thank you, Dr. Amarachi. Um, as I previously said in the beginning of the webinar, I think that it's very complex to talk about the issues of human rights globally, but also even within regions. So even if we just talk about sub-Saharan Africa, it's also very complex to talk about human rights. Now, the reason for that is that, as we know, the sub-Saharan African region is a very diverse region. We have countries that are as small as Cape Verde with 500,000 people, very homogeneous country. To we have, Nigeria, which, has millions and millions of people, more than 100 different ethnicities and languages. So of course, the human rights challenges in those different contexts are going to be different. Um, when we talk about human rights, we also should think about the Sustainable Development Goals, which were developed and were supposed to be achieved by 2030. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals are 17 goals that would allow for people to live better and healthier lives in this planet. So there are goals linked to gender equality, there's goals linked to ending poverty, healthcare, etc. The good thing about these sustainable development goals is that they also give us indicators and metrics, so that if we compare what individual countries are doing in terms of different goals, we can see if we are in the right track to achieve them or not. So even though these SDGs, they give us goals to strive for, it is very hard for us to gather the data necessary to assess our progress. Why? Because the collection of demographic data is very time consuming. It is also an expensive process. We know that with COVID, most of the international funds have been mobilized towards pandemic response, recovery, prevention, etc. And so less funds are actually allocated to assess the progress of these goals. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly, access to education is a big issue. So 18% of children are not able to go to school. This number also differs by the gender. So boys, usually it's 16% of boys cannot attend school, but then 21% of girls cannot attend school. So this is an issue. Now, related to healthcare, only fewer than 50% of Africans can actually access healthcare.
Mm.
And many African countries spend way less than 10% of their GDP in improving access to healthcare for their people. Now, in terms of access to employment and decent work, we know that 60% of women in sub-Saharan Africa work in agriculture, which is often underpaid and very laborious. Underemployment is as high as 50% for women living in sub-Saharan Africa today. So all of these issues, we know that they are happening. We know we have to make strides to solve these issues by 2030. And the challenge really is to make sure we are moving in the right path and making sure that we have the data to attest to the fact that we are moving in the right path. in terms of solving these issues.
Wow, thank you. So do you have something to add, Dr. Necker, please?
Yes, just really quickly, the status of human rights in Africa as a whole, we all know that it's has been historically a huge issue, a huge challenge that is probably going to be with us for generations after all of us are here. But I'm choosing to believe that there's a paradigm shift that's happening right now. If we look at recent protests, such as NSARS in Nigeria, that's mainly focused on many issues, but one of the topmost being police brutality, lack of respect and value of human life. We have hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter in Zimbabwe that's also protesting and making known the issues of police brutality and a crackdown on anything that opposes the people in power. You have Kenyan protests that's also focused on anti-corruption, which is a consistent issue on the continent. Shut it all down is another hashtag that's trending in the country of Namibia, and that's focused on fighting gender-based violence. So human rights, we could talk about this for years and years and years. Like Eliana stated, it's quite a complex discussion to have. But I think as of recent, and I'm hoping that we don't lose momentum, there is a shift that's going on in regards to all of the human rights related issues that we are having right now. Another very, very a huge issue that doesn't have as much limelight or not discussed as much is the issue of human trafficking. That is a highly lucrative business that hugely impacts the continent of Africa. And so there's so many different issues that we need to address in order to really get down to the bottom of what's going on in Africa in regards to, human rights.
So what I hear from what you and Eliana is saying is that this stems from a lot of issues. So there are a lot of things that this stems from. So again, we look at it from in terms of gender inequality, in terms of education, for example. We also look at it in terms of pay. I mean, this is not just an issue with Africa, but also an issue all around the world. Now, again, I think Eliana mentioned the Sustainable Development Goal. And one of the challenges, or one of the things I find really challenging, is how these sustainable development goals are understood and interpreted within the African context. So again, we're also aware about the African Union agenda for 1963 to 2063. I think you've seen that. And part of the agenda is that they are now trying to link the various priority areas within this agenda. So the AU Agenda 2063, and trying to link it with some aspect of the UN Sustainable Development Goal. Now, how achievable is this? Because I feel that, in Africa, a lot of leaders, and you talked about corruption, Dr. Onuma, how can all of these things be fused together? How do they understand these things and interpret it within the African context for us to at least make progress in the area of human rights?
So I'm very glad that you mentioned the question of regionality. It's very important that different regions, they consider the specific problems that they have and innovative ways to fix those problems. I do think that the Sustainable Development Goals are a good guideline for the things that should be achieved so that people can actually, fully enjoy their human rights. But there needs to be more regional action on these matters related to poverty, education, gender equality, etc. So, for example, if we think about access to the political sphere, the average for Africa of women participation in politics is only 27%. However, Rwanda has the highest rate of female political participation. And so there are great examples. We can look at some African countries, and learning from their best practices, learning, studying the cases of how they became leaders in different spheres, and trying to see if those are models that can be replicated to other countries. Now, we know that the example for Rwanda is a delicate one because it came from a real necessity of the people after the genocide, but surely there are many lessons that they have learned in terms of empowering women to take more leadership positions that can be applied in other African countries.
How do we move forward? I think that was the main point in the question that she asked. How do we move forward? We can do that so many different ways. Just dialogue. What we're doing now is part of um, what we're doing and the action that we're putting forth to move forward. Having conversations, having dialogue about different things that are happening. For example, the example that Eliana gave is who can we use as case studies of things that are working and things that are not working, and how can we implement those positive changes into the diverse cultures across the continent and across the diaspora. So the first thing we can do is to start to have conversations, which we're actively doing, and Osiri University is at the forefront of having those kind of conversations. Another thing is that when you look at Africa as a whole, we talked about gender equality. When we look at most positions of power, they're mostly dominated by men. We do have examples such as that Ms. Eliana has talked about, where there's a larger percentage of participation by women. But those who are in those positions of power, those seats of leadership, need to proactively make steps to try and diversify our leadership, our governments, our boards across the continent, school leaders across the board, both at the executive level and otherwise. But there needs to be proactive action, and we need to not be selfish, or leaders need to not be selfish about what's happening. Okay, so it's for our own good, it's for the good of the future generation, if we are able to come to a place where not only are these leaders making proactive strides into diversifying our those in positions of power, but also women also need to step forward and find their voices and step into these roles, so that we can add our voice and lend our voice in helping solve a lot of the problems that we are having. Okay, one of the most important ways, or the most efficient ways of change, is doing it from within the system, even if the system is not what we want it to be. And so we need to step forward and be a part of the system that we're hoping to change. And so I think that's one of the many things that needs to be done for us to move forward in solving many of the issues that we're having on the continent.
Good. I just wanted to continue with you, Dr. Anuma, to how can we practically work to infuse Maat in our lives? And I know that's a huge question. That's a huge question, because that's a world-changing question. But just provide your thoughts of how you think that this concept of balance can be infused into human society at this late stage.
Yeah. So it's certainly never too late. We can start now. One thing that the principle of Maat, or the philosophy of Maat, focuses on is self-mastery. Who are we? Do we know who we are? When you look at the Black race, or Black people across the world, do we know that we all started from Africa? Do we know that we were all African first before we became anything else? Do we know who we are? I think it starts with us really looking at the mirror and digging deep and finding out the richness of where we're coming from. It starts there. That's one place to start. When we practice Maat and we are actively seeking to self-master, learn, research where we're coming from, that's going to help us focus on a lot of the other things that will is part of solving this problem. I think in self mastery, there's a lot of people, and I think I've noticed recently, are really focusing more on living their truth. Truth is one of the concepts under Mayat, right? So when you start to learn who you are, what you're doing is finding out the truth. Um, that's the first concepts in this philosophy. And as we master each thing, from truth, we can go to balance, we can go to order, and so on and so forth. Obviously, it doesn't have to be in that particular order. We can choose to address whichever is
Right.
most appropriate at the time. But I think self-mastery really is the start to solving a lot of and addressing a lot of the challenges that we're having.
Right. As I said earlier, Maya is a huge concept, and human rights itself is a huge concept. So, Elena, I'd like to get your thoughts on how we can practically address human rights on a global level. And again, this is also a huge question, and I'm not asking for the ultimate answer or the ultimate question. I'm just trying to get your thoughts on how we can practically address the issue of human rights with so much going on in the world today. Right? It's just a lot. It really is a lot. Every morning we wake up and there's something new happening in the world, something different, some crazy. But just your thoughts on how we can practically address the problem of human rights, uh, across the globe.
I think that if we're looking to address human rights issues in the world, we need to also know what caused them. So I think that one of the reasons why there's still such a big quantity of human rights violations going on in the world is due to two things. So one is accountability or a lack of accountability. So when we have political leaders, like for example, with the Maputo Protocol, African Union leaders, they said that they would actually they would ratify laws so that women had more access to the political sphere, so that there was no discrimination against women in accessing employment, etc. But we've seen that the implementation since then has been very patchy. The same thing happened, for example, when African leaders said that they would dedicate 15% of the GDPs towards improvement of healthcare. And this happened in 2000.
Mm.
Today, we know that the average is 6.2% of African countries' GDP actually goes to healthcare. So there hasn't been enough progress in these areas. And I would say it's because there is a lack of accountability of the political leaders. Then the other issue is also resources, because we know a lot of the things that we discussed um, and that are indispensable so that we can have a good life and so that we can actually enjoy our human rights, they actually are financially, they have some financial cost. So given especially the health pandemic that is going on this year, we can understand why political leaders would have less resources to allocate maybe to areas related to education, gender equality, etc. But this cannot be put in the back burner. So we know that countries that have, um, in which the people have more access to opportunities are usually better countries, are usually healthier countries, and they're usually wealthier countries. So we really need to start making progress on human rights, also for prosperity.
Good. Good.
And I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. of particular importance. One of the first things you said was to know and understand the problem. And again, I think that's critical because I mean things are coming to light now in the world, but what we're dealing with in the world, they're not new problems, right? They're old problems. So the fact it's important that people are becoming aware, but that is the first most critical step that has been holding a lot of people back for a long time is just knowing, just understanding what the problems are, and to be able to place them not only in historical context but in the context of our present conditions, and as well, in the context of us looking towards the future. So
Definitely.
I think that point of knowledge is critical.
Yeah. And even with the End SARS movement now, we've seen the role that information and social media had uh,
Right,
Yes.
in really strengthening the movement. We've seen this example of how social media can be used to share information and make sure that people are aware of their rights and they're fighting for their rights in the public sphere. So it's actually a very exciting time. And um, also in terms of inter continental, let's say, solidarity. So we know that when Black Lives Matters protests started happening in the US, social media, through that information
right,
sharing, actually those protests were taken all over the world. So we're starting to see
right.
the same thing with the ANSARS movement. And so we're hoping that we can find international solidarity in order to resolve problems that maybe are local problems or maybe are just, generalized global problems.
Yeah.
Right.
I think
And
um,
go ahead.
if I may add, um, accountability, and I saw in in the chat that someone had posted about that. That's really huge. Our leaders don't feel like they're accountable to anyone, right?
Hmm.
Um, at all. Things are done behind closed doors. No one knows about anything. So why would they be held accountable if we don't even know what they're doing, right? And so I think when earlier I mentioned that I feel like there's this paradigm shift that's happening, and social media is at the forefront of that paradigm shift. Now the whole world knows, right? NSTARS is not a new struggle.
Right.
Years ago, there was an NSTARS protest that had, I don't know what the numbers were, maybe less than 100 people at the protests. But today, even my local community here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, had an NSARS um,
Right.
demonstration. So that is part of hopefully addressing the accountability issue is now the whole world is hearing, now the whole world is knowing. If that's what needs to be happen for people in positions of power to be accountable for their actions, then that's wonderful. We need to move forward with that and spread the word. Let everyone know, record everything, post it on all social media platforms. Let the whole world know. If that's what it's going to take um, to bring about accountability, then that's wonderful. Um, I, when we go back to the concept of Maat, if we could hold ourselves accountable, ideally that's where we should be. We shouldn't need the whole world to know about our issues. We should be accountable to the people who elected us in into positions of power. We should feel like we owe them because we do. Being in a position, being a public servant means that we are serving the public. And that's something that our leaders historically in Africa, in the African continent and in the diaspora don't practice. And so in the conversation, that's something that we need to really, really strongly work on. That's a huge challenge that we need to overcome in order to be able to move forward in a lot of these other issues that we're having.
And in addition to that, on the point of accountability and visibility that you both brought up, um, and in the spirit of the critical nature of history, Martin Luther King wanted cameras at his protests, and at when the cops were at their most violent, he wanted the cameras there. Why? Because he wanted the world to see what was happening, and that's precisely why it is important for everybody have their cameras out and to film these things that are going on, the protests. I hated watching George Floyd die for that 8 minutes and 46 seconds because we did watch him die. But
Yes.
I'm glad that we all saw it because it helps the world, not just America, the world to understand the critical nature of the problem. And that is a strategy that's been in play for a number of years, thanks to Dr. King.
Mhm.
Um, and that's exactly how we should continue
Yeah.
to make to
One
hold
last
people
thing to
accountable.
add in
Go
that
ahead.
regard, Dr. Easterlin, was going back to NSARS. The most violent part of it was when supposedly the military shut off all the lights
Mm,
at the protests, and that's when the shooting occurred. So that's one of the biggest tools of the people who are in power have used this tool of hiding things for the
yeah,
longest time.
they don't want to be seen.
We see today. Yes, yes,
Yeah, yeah, they don't want to be seen. They don't want the
exactly,
world to see them
exactly.
as the monsters that they are. That's a very
Right,
important point.
right.
What is Maat? And how can Africans restore Maat? I don't know what it is, so I'm waiting to hear what you have to say about that.
Yes, yes. So I did touch on it a little bit earlier. Um, so in the course that I'm going to be teaching, we're going to be looking at the issue of gender equality in Africa from the perspective of Maat. This is a philosophy. Maat is an ancient Egyptian goddess. And she is now the concept of, and I'll read what the philosophy is. It's a philosophy um, that takes a path to honest government, spiritual, social ethics, self mastery, and mystical enlightenment. And in Maat, there's 7 principles that make up this philosophy. The first is truth. The second is balance. The third is order. The fourth is harmony. The fifth is righteousness. The sixth is morality, and the seventh is justice. So in ancient Egypt, these were all priests and pharaohs and their families were expected to practice each of these 7 principles. And not only were they expected to practice those principles, but members of the community, that's you and I, everyone was also expected to practice these principles. And of course, in practicing all of that, is a society that's a whole lot more wholesome, has balance, and I will argue didn't have so many of the issues that we're having now. And so in restoring Maat, if our leaders are practicing these principles and we ourselves, in addition, practice these principles, it directly addresses all of the issues that we're having, ideally. So that's what that philosophy is.
Oh, thank you. Considering all that you've said, it could be very challenging, considering all the things you mentioned, the factors within Africa right now, and how that can, how we can restore Ma'at, as you called it, in Africa. So again, there's a whole lot of conversations to be had, and I think that our leaders need to do more action rather than talking, because all we see is a lot of talking and no action. But again, very interesting, because you are designing this course and then Dr. Easterlin is designing a course on collective action. Dr. Easterlin, do you see any connection between your course and her course?
Oh, definitely, definitely. Collective action is essentially an effort to restore Ma'at, particularly on the part of African people. We're fighting to restore balance. And I just think that's the crux of the problem. Not just balance in our communities, but balance on the planet and how we function as vessels on our planet, right? It's not just the racism and oppression that has the world out of balance, but as well the environment and problems between men and women not being able to connect on very basic human rights. Um, And so, yeah, this is critically important uh, concept of Maat to this concept, or not the concept, but collective action. Without Maat, then what are we fighting for? Without us pushing for a sense of balance in the world, or resetting of balance in the world, I'll say, then what are we fighting for? Definitely.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to kind of chime in on the question of Mayat, just to give some further context for the audience. Um, we understand, say for the United States, we have the symbol of the woman with the scales and the blindfold, right? This symbology can be connected directly to the concept, or the goddess Mayat, who is often seen holding the scales with her wings spread out in a very even fashion. That evenness is the where the wings are spread out, supposed to symbolize the even tone with which humanity is supposed to connect with each other. Very
Yes.
fair and even tone. So just to provide a little bit more context for the audience. And I'm really looking forward to that class, and both classes as well, for Osiri University.
Yeah, kind of very interesting. But we spoke about leadership, and we spoke about what our leaders are doing currently and how that impacts on us, even in Africa. Now, is there any difference between men and women in power?
Mm.
So,
I
sorry, I'm not,
was going
I'm
to
not
ask that
trying.
same
Of
question.
course.
I'm not
Yeah.
trying to be sexist, but it's just what's the difference between the
Of
two?
Yeah.
course.
Uh, Thank you. So in terms of the differences between men and women in power, I would like to think about them in three different spaces. So we can talk about the household, we can talk about in business, and we can talk about in politics. Now, several studies
Nice.
have shown that when women are the head of the household in low income settings and low income countries, that the children stay in school for longer, the distribution of food is more equitable, and the family as a whole has better health and education outcomes. Now, that is just, it's been proven by many, many studies. Now, if we talk about women in business, in terms of the core leadership skills, actually, we do not find huge differences between women and men. So women and men, they have the same capacity for leadership. However, women are less confident than men. 37% of all women will say that they don't feel as prepared or ready to take on leadership positions compared to only 30% of the men, even though they are equally capable of doing a good job. And then in politics, what we see is that men and women, they value, it can be said that men and women value different things when it comes to politics and qualities to have in politics. So actually, women value more being honest and ethical, being transparent. Women, I forgot to add this. Um, in terms of being leaders in the household, women will actually invest more than men in durable goods linked to hygiene, sanitation, etc. So women will invest more in buying, for example, kitchen appliances, washing machine for the home. But so these are things that benefit the whole family. And I think that in a way, when it comes to the management of the finances, it also has in term when it comes to the management of finances, we can also see that women are generally better at making those investments for the long-term reward. So these are some of the differences between women and men in different leadership spaces, and I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what Dr. Neka also has to say about this subject, which is really
Yes.
fascinating.
Liana, I think really you've covered it. women and men is there a difference between men and women empowered? Most definitely. There is. And I think ideally, when we have a balanced society, we have just as equal contribution from women and men in positions of power, right? So men contribute what have their own contributions, and women have their own contributions, and then we work together with our own unique strengths to create a society that's balanced, right? Um, I think and I keep going back to NSARS again, maybe because I'm from Nigeria, and of course that's really been trending recently. But women have really found their voice in this movement. If you look back, one of the most recent protests was the one that took place in Anambra State. It was led by a lot of Igbo celebrities, and the woman on their t-shirts was Aisha Yusufu. If you guys know, her picture went viral because she's the lady who had her mask on, she had her hijab on, and she stood with her fist in the air. So she's probably one of the more notable women who stand as a huge pillar of this recent movement. But there are also other women. DJ Switch is a woman who made the shooting known. Her live video, I think, was viewed by 150,000 people around the world. So like Eliana pointed out, we're not as confident, and historically, why would we be? When women have been kind of beaten down for generations, for decades, centuries, it's understandable that we are in a position where we may not be as confident to take on these leadership roles that really we are needed to balance out the chaotic society that we're in now. But I think women, we are finding our voice. We are stepping into, positions of leadership more. That point that she made is really important, that we need to gather ourselves together, collective action as a group. We need to step forward, continue to find our voices in issues that impact us, impact our children, impact our families. And we need to take ownership. We need to take ownership and move forward in all the different movements that are taking place to address all these challenges that we're having. We have to step into our role as a vital part of solving the issues that we're having. We have to be part of that conversation. We are required in order for that, for the solution to not only be created, but to be implemented and to consistently be continue on generations to come. So we're a vital part of the conversation. It's wonderful in so many movements across the world. We are finding our voice, but most recently, the one that strikes home to me is the position that we're taking in regards to these NSARS, and lots of other things. Eliana, I appreciated how you used statistics to show this. It's not just our opinion, but you showed research that actually just does show that we are a vital part of moving things along and progressing, moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think this actually brings to mind the whole concept of glass ceiling, glass cliff. I'm sure a lot of us are conversant with that. And the fact that, some in a glass ceiling, for example, women are unable to progress or advance in a certain profession. However, for glass cliff, you're only brought in when it is an adverse situation that needs kind of, she's going to be the woman who will be the superwoman to deliver us out of this. And we see that a lot of women, statistically and also historically, for example, in England, Theresa May was a kind of a negative kind of example of a glass cliff. But again, that's as a result of a lot of factors, not necessarily because she was a bad leader. Dr. Easterling, you're the only man on the panel. So do you have any contrary opinion, or do you have any view about all of this?
No contrary opinions at all. Just wanted to add to it that BLM was founded by three black women. So it's critical, as well as the Me Too movement. A black woman started the Me Too movement here in the states.
Hmm.
So the women's role in any struggle is critical, and their role on this planet is even more. I mean, they say if you give a woman something, that she'll multiply it, right? So if you give her a house, she'll make a home out of it. If you give her love, she'll make a family out of it. So the role of women is critical as we move forward, and essential for reestablishing a balance on this planet.
Wow, thank you so much. I just have a question that I must ask. It's on the Q&A chat, and I just want to ask anybody can actually take on that question. It's by anonymous attendee, and he says human rights encompasses a number of components, some of which have gone against African values we stand for. So this person is asking, how shall the LGBTQ come to play? So anyone, the floor is open.
Okay. I think that is a very interesting question. Even when we talk about African values, we have to be honest and say there are values that are really specific to countries, etc., and specific regions. When it comes to the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights, when it comes to the issue of LGBT, we have to consider the rights that we have decided has in the world together, that were the rights of all people. And in my opinion, we should apply that. So also making sure that people have access to things, that people have access to services, and that people have the right to make their own opinion about specific issues. And I'm talking about liberty of expression, as I am talking about gender identity, as I'm talking about access to abortion. So I think it's very worrying to assume that African values would be against different forms of gender identity or against abortion, etc. And we shouldn't spread that narrative.
Yeah. So we've been discussing human rights. Human rights is human rights. It's all people. It's inclusive. It's not exclusive. So it applies to every single human being. The only beings it might not apply to will be who's not human. But when we're talking about human rights, it applies to all people. And we have to, going back to Maat, one of the concepts is truth. We have to be truthful with ourselves. We have to look ourselves in the face, look in the mirror and be truthful. Mm-hmm. You cannot be successful at human rights if you are going to be exclusive. You must be inclusive. Otherwise, then let's call it something else. We're not interested in really what the truth of human rights is. Let's just go ahead and call it something else and then move forward that way. So when it comes to the LGBT community, they are included or should be included. Historically, I would say they have been excluded, but they have to be included because we're talking about human beings. That's right. It seems simple, and I know it's not. Historically, we may choose to believe, and historically, we have traditional beliefs and traditional practices that may show otherwise. But ultimately, if we are going to practice Maat, if we're going to restore Maat, we must be truthful about what we're doing. And I think that's one of the issues we're having is we're living lives and we're not really being truthful. People, you're a public servant. You were elected to be in a public seat to serve the public. You're not being truthful. What you're doing is you're in there and you're being selfish. You're serving yourself. That's not being truthful. Okay, so we could go on and on and on. But when it comes to the issue of human rights, it's quite simple. We can't be exclusive in that struggle.
Wow. Wow, that's powerful. Thank you so much. I would wish us to go on and on and on, but I'm just very conscious of time. We are now 2 minutes, after the time that we have said we're going to end it. So I just want to say to you, Dr. Nneka Onuma, thank you so much for, coming up on this particular Ubuntu dialogue today. And also Miss Eliana Martins as well. We do appreciate you, adding to this whole conversation. It was great seeing you all. And also Dr. Paul Easterling, our God of Humanities, thank you as well. So to all our attendees, thank you for keeping the chat buzzing and, adding your voice also to this whole conversation.